My name's Dave Connery, and welcome to my HO scale model railroad. I call it the Sierra Carson Truckee. That's because the lower level models scenes from the Sierra Railway, the upper level models scenes from the Virginia Truckee. I've connected to the two levels with a Helix, which emulates a crossing of the Sierras over Carson Pass, thus Sierra Carson Truckee. As you'll get to see, the layout is in very tight quarters. It's a very small space, basically the space of one car in a two-car garage. We don't have basements, and so garages are our most easily used space to find for a layout in the house. So what I'd like to do is take you around the layout and show you a few scenes that I think you might find interesting on the way I've modeled these two different railroads. We'll start with the lower level, the Sierra level. We'll go and look at 3 or 4 different scenes on the Sierra level, and then we'll move to the V&T level on the upper level. So I'll just introduce you to the little vignette or area that we're in, and you can get a chance to understand how I've modeled those areas. So I'd like to start our little tour with Oakdale. This is the town where the Sierra started building in 1897. I modeled in 1929. At that point it houses cannery for hunts, grain elevators, the engine facility, and then the Hershey's factory, which was the West Coast candy factory for the company. Most of them are all kits. Builders and scale, sass and vinegar, and then 2 Campbell's kits makes up the Hunts complex. The engine facility is actually part of the John Allen set from Fine Scale Miniatures. The barrel factory is a Campbell's kit. And then the Hershey's factory is a kit bash of 2 different Fine Scale Miniatures kit, Roland Sawyer Chemical and Baron Gold's Tannery. So I've combined those 2 into a single facility, and then Federspiel Furniture is another Fine Scale Miniatures kit on the end of town. So there are actually 2 depots in Oakdale. The SP depot was shared with the Sierra, and I scratch built that. That building still exists. And then the Santa Fe depot, Santa Fe came into Oakdale in 1903. That was scratch built just using photographs. So here we have locomotive number 22 bringing a few cars down from Tuolumne to Jamestown, which was the headquarters for the Sierra Railway. Oh, look at that. Looks like a couple of the boys have got somebody strung up on the tree. Well, it's one of those diesel salesmen. At Jamestown is the Roundhouse. That's a scratch-built model of the Roundhouse that is at Jamestown, Railtown 1897 State Historic Park. It is also the machine shop, and it has a full interior. Next to that was the General Office Building that burned in 1987. And then next to that is the Freight Depot. That is still there. I had to shorten it a bit, but it's scratch-built. And then finally the water tank, which is known as the Petticoat Junction Water Tank. By the way, the Sierra is still a functioning railroad. It still operates trains during the week from Riverbank all the way up to the lumber mill on the east side of Sonora. But first we'll pass by the Sonora Plaster Company. That was at one time the largest producer of plaster and lime products in California, that back in 1910, but it continued in operation until the early 1980s. So I used the kit. It's the Sheepscott Models kit of the lime factory, and it's a nice kit. Unfortunately, if you notice, there's a plastic cover in front of it, and that's because I have bumped into it innumerable times, and eventually I put that there to protect myself from my own layout. So now we're in Sonora. The key feature here is the Sonora Depot, and I'm rather proud of that building. It was scratch built. It's a complex building. It's in what's called the pagoda style. The lower floor was done in Columbia marble. The upper stories are cedar shakes from other places in Tuolumne County. As you might have guessed, I really enjoy building. I consider myself a railroad modeler more than a model railroader. That is, I model railroads. And then to its left is the freight house, which is also scratch built. And then behind that is Hales and Simon as a kind of a almost semi-flat. That's a a key industry there in Sonora. It originally started out as Teamsters, and today it became a large lumber and building products distributor. And then in the background is the Standard Lumber Company's planing mills. They brought their rough cut wood from higher mills down to Sonora on trackage rates on the Sierra to complete things like a shook and Venetian blinds, doors, windows, sills, and other fine wood products. So at the end of the Sierra is Tuolumne City, and that's the home of the West Side Lumber Company. The railroad built to Tuolumne, then they built the West Side Lumber Company, operated it for a few years, sold it to some Michigan and Wisconsin lumbermen. But the model I have is actually a model of that lumber mill. Although I've had to compress it in a few places in order to fit my space, it also hides the support for the second level behind it. But maybe more interesting than the building itself is all of the HON3 pieces of rolling stock that I built, almost all from kits, and most of those from Rio Grande models kits, a couple from Scotia or Simpson models. So that's the end. It's actually a return loop on my railroad. It's the end of the main line for the Sierra. Okay, so there was an extension, a branch line that went from Jamestown to Angels Camp. It was 19 and a half miles long, and it was quite a challenge to build because it had to go through Table Mountain, and it had to cross the Stanislaus River. That's a very deep canyon. It required switchbacks on both north and south sides of the river and a long bridge across the river. I did build the River Canyon and a bridge that crosses it. It's a BET models that they're out of business. But I did also build a scale model of the crossing of the Angels Branch of the Stanislaus River. But that turned out to be 6 feet 4.5 inches long, and it's on display in a diorama at the Tuolumne County Historical Society in Sonora. So after you cross the river, you go by the Carson Hill Mill. The Carson Hill Mill is actually a kit by Railroad Avenue. And then as you come into Angels, you pass the Angels water tank. That's a kit from Master Creations of the Angels water tank. So that was very appropriate. You go past a couple of Campbell's kits, an engine house, and a brewery that I call the Leaping Frog Brewery, based on the story by Mark Twain. And then you come to the scratch-built depot, a building that still exists in Angels Camp. It's currently a residence. The line ended with the turntable, a unique kind of design, but it was an Armstrong turntable, which meant you had to have strong arms because you physically turn the turntable with the locomotive on it, which was not as hard as you might think. So we come to the last scene on the lower level, which I call Jackson. It's not really on the Sierra, but if they were to cross Carson Pass, the train would have extended from Angels to Jackson and then gone up over Carson Pass, much the way Highway 88 does today. But this is kind of a special little scene for me. It commemorates actually a couple of friends. I have a hotel here. It's called the Long River Inn. Jim Long was one of my friends who has passed away, who helped work on the layout. But up front here is a special model. This was built by my good friend Jim Vale. Jim modeled this from a photograph of the fruit shed at Ralph on the Sierra Railway. It doesn't belong right here. It belongs more over towards Sonora. But I had this spot left when Jim passed away about 2 years ago. I was able to acquire this, and it means a lot to me to have it on my layout, work of Jim Vale. So this is the end, and here the line enters the Helix. I hadn't really mentioned the Helix. We have actually a two-track Helix, both trains from the lower level in Oakdale as well as from here. It's gotten about 6 or 8 inches up. Enter the two-track Helix that goes up to the upper level, and we'll get to that next. Well, now I'd like to share with you the upper level of my layout. Again, my layout's a two-level layout. It has a two-track Helix for standard gauge, and then it also has a narrow gauge Helix to connect narrow gauge on the two levels. While I'm thinking about the two levels, I like to mention the backdrops. I was very lucky to have two different friends agree to help me with my layout by painting backdrops. A good deal of the backdrop is done by Al Massey. Al did a wonderful job. Al is also responsible for a lot of the work that was done on my steam locomotives. He's a marvelous mechanic with brass, and he's added the electronics and done the painting. So I really owe a lot to Al. The wall on that side, over by what we'll see later on as Carson City in Roundhouse, was done by Denise Showalter. Denise did a really beautiful job. Unfortunately, she had breast cancer and passed away a number of years ago, and certainly I miss both of them because Al now lives in South Carolina and I don't get to see him, and occasionally email message. So the upper level is the Virginia Truckee, and I might mention also the fact that I really had fallen in love with the Sierra, and I thought I was going to build models of the Sierra Railway when I read the Silver Short Line book by Worm and DeMoro, and I said, oh, what a great railroad. I really want to model this V&T. And since I couldn't really make up my mind, I found a reference to an offer by the Sierra to make a connection to the V&T over the Sierra Mountains. They were going to go over Reno Pass, totally impossible. I chose to emulate that. They did complete it over Carson Pass, and that is the Helix, is Carson Pass. So you don't get to see any of Carson Pass. So my V&T railroad extends from Reno to Minden, where it connects, in theory, to the Sierra coming over Carson Pass. So we'll start here at Reno, and we have Virginia Street in Reno right here with the famous Reno sign. And most of these buildings, of course, are kits that I've just repainted or lettered for specific buildings in Reno. And then we have the Reno Depot. Now, this depot was the depot there until 1926 when they built the present depot. I mocked the present one up in cardboard. It was just out of scale for everything else. And so I decided I would use the earlier depot, which I think had a lot more character. And so that's the model that I scratch built here for Reno. So the first train coming through Reno is the Southern Pacific train on the double-track SP main line. It's passing by the scratch-built Reno Depot. The SP used this front side, and the back side was used by the V&T, and we'll see a V&T train go by in just a few moments. So coming along the backside of the Southern Pacific Depot is the V&T portion of the depot. The V&T train now passes behind that. Then crosses over the Truckee River on a scratch-built bridge that emulates the bridge that was used until 1891. It then passes by the scratch-built water tank and then past the scratch-built engine house that the V&T had across the river in Reno. And then it heads off the visual portion of the layout. Okay, so locomotive number 27 and its freight train are now approaching Carson City. We'll watch the train come into the Carson City yard, and we'll stop in front of the depot. So after getting its orders, engineer of locomotive number 27 continues on beyond Carson, around underneath the flume that comes down from Lake Tahoe and proceeds on to Minden. Okay, well, our train number 27 just come into Minden. Minden was the southernmost point on the V&T. It was a branch that was built from Carson City down to the town of Minden in 1906. At the same time, the people in Minden built the Minden Flour Milling Company, which you see here. That's a CC Crow kit. It's all cast hydrocal. It's a wonderful kit. It was my intention to scratch build that building, and I didn't have to do it. The Minden Depot is actually mostly a freight depot with on the far side a small passenger annex. That is all scratch built. Now we've got locomotive number 25 with the 3-car passenger train. It's going to leave Minden. It'll head north through Carson City all the way to Reno. The main line goes underneath the Clear Creek flume. They logged the area around Lake Tahoe, rafted all the logs to Greenbrook. There they had a mill. They rough milled it. They loaded it onto narrow gauge cars, brought it to the top of Spooner Summit, and then they had a flume that they flumed it down the east side of the mountains and into the yard at Carson City. I think it's kind of an interesting model because I haven't seen flumes modeled on any other model railroads, and I thought it would add real touch to this railroad. So it turns out that locomotive number 25 needed a little bit of work on one of the steam chests. And so they decided to bring it into the engine house in Carson City. The Carson City engine house was really a remarkably huge building. I modeled just really a portion of it. It was known as the block house. It actually had 11 stalls. I've modeled 8 of those stalls. And although it looks pretty long on my layout, that's only 43% of the full length of the building. But I did include all of the key features. What I did was I made a series of rubber molds for each of the various wall sections and then cast them out of hydrocal, then glued them all together. In addition to the engine house in the facility, there was also, of course, the passenger station, which we've already seen, a freight station, an oil tank, 8-sided oil tank, which was kind of a challenge, and then a 2-sided water tank. So all of those were scratch built, the water tank, the oil tank, the paint shop, the freight shed, the passenger depot, and of course the large engine house. Now locomotive number 26 is going to take a freight train from Carson City up to Virginia City. It'll pass by the Carson City engine house, come up through Mound House, and then go through the American Flat Tunnel and snow sheds. They come out in Gold Hill, pass over the Crown Point Trestle in Gold Hill, past the depot, and then we'll take a look at it at the point of arrival in Virginia City. So the train's going across the Crown Point Trestle. This is the largest trestle on the V&T. An interesting curved structure. At both ends it had chutes that they would unload the cordwood on and then slide the cordwood down to the boiler houses down below. Also, one of the really unique features of this particular trestle is the walkway 1 story down along the outside of the curve. They were having problems with people using the trestle to cross from one side of the canyon to the other. It was a natural bridge. But of course, as the locomotive would come up and it would see people on the trestle, it would have to stop and slow down. So finally, the bridge department built this walkway a level down so that the engineer could clearly see that there was nobody up on the tracks. And then they insisted that people not cross on the tracks but use the walkway that they had built. Okay, we're now at the highest point on the layout in on the railroads, and that's Virginia City. in the mountains above Carson City in Nevada. Train number 26 is still down in Gold Hill. It hasn't made it up here, but you'll get a chance to see what Virginia City looks like, at least my reenactment of it. The depot and the passenger shed are both scratch built, and the mine structures here in Virginia City are a combination of kits and kit bashed. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for visiting my layout. Actually, you're one of the last people to probably see the layout because it is my intention to dismantle the layout in 5 or 6 weeks. I'm at an age where it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the layout, and I'd like to be the one in charge of taking it apart since I built it. I might want to add that the size of the layout, you can see it's obviously pretty cramped. It's 16 and a half feet long, 10 feet wide, and it's a room in my garage. And I'd like to kind of emphasize that by building that room, I've isolated the layout, and now a garage is a very difficult place to model a railroad because of the dust and other disturbances and things in the air. So by creating kind of an airtight room almost, I've been able to isolate this layout, and it doesn't get dusty. The track rarely needs cleaning, and it's provided a place for me to showcase my models. And so I appreciate you having a chance to see those. Thank you very much for being here.